Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales, Australia. I am Natalia Srnimarkovic and I lead the Australasian Society for Computers and the Law, Future Law Workstream, and on the Society's Managing Committee. We are a cross-disciplinary think tank promoting sustainable law, technology and society through education, policy, and it's a privilege to have His Honourable Michael Kirby as our long-standing patron. We've played a very active role in Global Rules as Code community. Just recently, we hosted the Global Rules as Code 2.0 plenary, the first of its kind, and attracted a global audience, globally acclaimed keynote speakers, and over 150 cross-disciplinary thought leaders across 10 plus countries. That included Parliamentary Council, regulators, lawyers, data scientists, technologies. We were all co-designing Rules as Code 2.0 in an interactive way with roundtables. Now for today's masterclass, we've designed this masterclass for a diverse audience, those that are new to Rules as Code, as well as those thought leaders that are joining us, thought leaders in their own right in this area. On last count, we had over 100 registrants. So for those of you that have attended previous masterclasses, welcome back. And to newcomers, we hope that you find this masterclass enlightening and inspiring. You know, context is king. And for many of us working in legal or law technology, unraveling and codifying contextual meaning is both a challenge and yet, you know, critically important to the work we do. And indeed, the values, the fundamental values that we hold so dearly: democracy, separation of powers, rule of law. So it is an honour to have Dr. Megan Ma and Dr. Jason Grant Allen with us today. They're big brains in computational law. Quick bios. Dr. Megan Ma is a Code X fellow at Stanford Law School. Her research considers the limits of legal expression, focusing on how code could become the next legal language. The work reflects on the frameworks of legal interpretation and its overlap in linguistics, logic, and aesthetic programming. Megan is Managing Editor of the MIT Computational Law Report and a research affiliate at the Singapore Management University in their Centre for Computational Law. She has a PhD in law and is a lecturer at leading universities, having lectured in and still continues to lecture in artificial intelligence, legal reasoning, legal semantics, and public health law. So a very, very qualified speaker to run this masterclass. We also, of course, have with us Dr. Jason Allen Grant, who is a qualified Australian barrister and solicitor and New York attorney and counsellor at law. Jason co-founded Sterling and Rose Digital Law in 2000 this year, and a boutique incorporated legal practice where his practice focuses on the application of emergent technologies, focusing on blockchain, distributed ledger technology, including law of money, cryptocurrency, stable coins, etc., digital assets. And we are delighted that Jason has recently co-authored and published a book with a chapter in it from Megan. Jason is a much valued member of the Australasian Society for Computers and Law, holding the post of Chapter Chair for the Australian state of Tasmania. So without further ado, I would like to open by asking both Megan and Jason a question about their story, how they came to computational law. And Jason, if you could tell us a bit about your recent publication. So first starting with Megan, thank you.
Hi everyone, it is such a privilege to be here. So thank you very much again for the invitation. So I guess a little bit about my story. It might be a quirky one. I grew up with a fascination with language. I always thought that it was weird, the association between the word itself and meaning. And most linguists see this as sort of the non-literal connection between what we call as the symbols that make up these words and what they actually mean. So I used to create something of my own dialect, perhaps because I came from a stricter household that, you know, you had to put money in every time you had a swear word or whatnot. So to save a bit of coin here and there, I decided to make up my own language. And how that kind of relates to computational law, I've been fascinated by the way that we have to actually change or translate even from natural language into code. So that's kind of my entry point into this.
Thank you, Megan. Jason.
Thanks so much. And Natalia, I'd also like to start specifically with the acknowledgement of country. I'm in the Launceston region in the north of Tasmania, which is traditionally Palawa country, and I'd like to acknowledge Palawa elders, past, present, and emerging. What brought me to computational law, and thank you so much for the very gracious introduction, and I'd echo Megan. It's a real privilege actually to be invited to take part in this masterclass today. What brought me to computational law was a couple of things. So during my PhD research, I was actually working in public law, and I was working on the concept of office and the concept of official action and what it means to act in an official capacity as opposed to a private or a personal capacity. And that was in the context of an examination of the judicial review of non-statutory executive powers. And of course, with non-statutory executive powers, there's no legislative text. And so actually working out what the power is and what legal basis it has is this preliminary first step. And that really sucked me in the course of, I think, chapter 6 or something of the thesis into deontic logic and the logic of operations. And this was my first brush, admittedly, you know, somewhat late in my sort of academic legal career then, with what it means to really start to formalize legal propositions. And I struggled with formal notation and so forth, and some of these wonderful legal theory textbooks. And you know, there's great sort of stuff from the sort of late 19th and early 20th century Germans, and there's these amazing Scandinavians, and they write a lot in English. So it was this wonderful new horizon, but also a very challenging field. So at the same time, I was involved in a blockchain-based startup at that stage when I was in Cambridge. In English law, which concerned the interpretation of a technical appendix, which calculated interest, or not interest, which calculated increases on site management fees for holiday chalets on the Welsh coast somewhere. Over the course of a 99-year lease, with this huge divergence that some leaseholders would be paying millions in 99 years and others a more reasonable sum. And then more recently, of course, with Sterling and Rose, smart legal contracts, Web3, crypto, and so forth are some of our core sort of practice areas. I would stress, you know, I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool crypto aficionado. You know, quite the opposite. I've taken generally an open-minded, skeptical sort of approach in terms of looking for real as opposed to apparent value propositions. And use cases and applications. And that was very much in the book, which I edited together with Peter Hun, and to which Megan contributed a fantastic chapter on the mathematization of legal language. So there's obviously quite a strong DLT and sort of Ethereum smart contract focus in the book, but the focus is much broader, and it tries to bottom down on precisely the question that Megan will be talking to us about today, which is generalizable. It's not just a problem specific to smart legal contracts, for example. It's also very important in the legislative and regulatory context, is when we actually either draft legal propositions in a formal language or try to translate natural language legal prose into a formal language. How do we do that? And what are the pitfalls to look out for, and what are the best practices that are emerging of legal design and legal engineering? So that's my story, and I'm very much looking forward to today, and thank you for the invitation.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this session. Such big brains in this area. Bit of housekeeping before we kick off. This session will be recorded, so please keep yourself on mute and cameras off. If you have questions, please pop them into the chat functions, and we will seek to address your questions. I will now hand over to Jason. We will answer some questions, or I'll invite you, perhaps Jason, as you're moderating the session, to answer questions as you go, if they fit into the conversation. We're adopting a slightly different format for this masterclass presentation, but thought we'd draw in the amazing expertise and insights and extra questions from Jason as we proceed through the masterclass. So enjoy, everyone, and please pop your questions into the chat function and we will answer them over the next 45 minutes. Thank you. Jason, over to you.
Thanks so much, Natalia, and thank you for the privilege and the ability to take part in today's session. I think Megan's really, a rising star in this area. I've been following her work for several years now, and this is, the latest in a number of conversations that we've had over that time that have all focused around some of these questions of meaning and translation, and in particular context. And I think that the real value that Megan's research brings is that it shines a light on an area which I feel is still somewhat neglected in the literature and also in some of the practical projects going on in the space, both in the context of sort of rules of code in the public law context and also in the smart legal contract context, and that's this focus on meaning and on translation, and on the different aspects of language, which focus on meaning, which focus on the logical structure of sentences and propositions, but that also focus on the context in which they're uttered and in which they're used by persons. And lately this has taken on a much more practical sort of focus for me, in terms of thinking about when I'm using any particular, or when a client, for example, is using any particular drafting language or drafting environment, what should they try to do, and what should they not try to do? What do they maybe need to go back to the client and take new instructions for, even given the current state of play? So, Megan, we've spoken just last week about this, and might that be a starting point? What is translation, and what's involved in translating something from natural language legal prose, legalese, into some form of code?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Jason. It's so exciting that you'll be moderating this session, not only because one of my first encounters actually with computational law and smart contracts was reading your paper and trying to unpack kind of language. So I have a few slides just to share today to kind of walk us through some of my thoughts on the class. I don't know if it's sharing. Are the slides visible? So part of my thinking, and before I kind of even enter into the realm of translation, there's a conversation that we had where we discussed legal language and what's its place and whether or not it's truly, the plague of legalese. Part of my journey as I was walking through my thesis is I came across a scholar named David Mellenkopf. And he saw himself as the enemy of legalese. In fact, he described it as a viscous sea of verbiage. But one of the things, and all these arcane uses of words, we always wonder whether or not there's place for it, and whether or not instead we should be drafting more clearly, more understandably for the public, in plain English or a plain language. And his argument was that, yes, we should get rid of legalese altogether. We should be using plain language. And what's interesting is that in itself, kind of the movement from legal language to plain language is a way of translation. It's deciding what, is a legal word or has legal meaning, as opposed to, an everyday speak. And interestingly, he came across this argument about why are we using words from Old English, Latin, and Middle English? Why are we using them to communicate the law? And actually, what's fascinating is that they are the plain language of that time. And just over time, people have gotten into the habit. It's become a ritual. And in recent kind of literature that's come out, I think a report done by MIT, they discovered that actually legal language, its purpose is not to communicate. In fact, legal concepts can be done very clearly if you were able to explain them well. So the question becomes, do we need legal language altogether?
I think that's such an interesting set of ideas, and I'm sure controversial ideas that you've sort of just set out. But I think it grounds really nicely in, especially in sort of Oxford language philosophy, and the idea that we don't just use words to say things, but we use words to do things. And especially in domains like law, which are highly conventional, sometimes, we have to utter a certain series of words in order not to make a truth claim about the world, or, if I say I hereby pronounce you man and wife, I'm not actually claiming that I believe you are actually man and wife. I'm making it the case. And that in this sort of context, antiquated language, as difficult as it is, and as rightly as we seek to avoid it in certain practical legal exercises, because we want the law to be understandable by its subjects. There's a strong rule of law, thing there. We want contracts to actually express the intention of the parties as they understand it as well, as closely as possible. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure that it does something. And that's why, when I've interacted, especially with American counsel, they'll have their boilerplate precedent, and they want that because they know exactly what it does, and they know exactly how the court is going to interpret it.
Absolutely. And kind of moving from the point of, should we preserve legal language in kind of that context? And so there have been, with consumer rights movements, this move from legalese into plain language. But people realize that legal language at the end of the day is shaped by natural language. So there are, there's this magic to natural language that it's infinitely expressible, but that could be a double-edged sword. And I'll go into that in a bit. But what we see actually now is that, not even thinking about moving into code, there are various ways in which legal language is being communicated. There's, the birth of comic contracts by Robert Del Roy, and those were ways of kind of describing to migrant workers who are not, literate in the language, or just maybe doesn't speak that particular language or English or whatnot, to be able to understand their rights. And so part of what I have been thinking about is this notion of, are we almost perpetuating some of the problems that we find, be it ambiguity, vagueness in natural language, just simply moving from legalese to plain language? Have we really tackled what is the core of the problem, and how do we actually want to draft clearer? And so something I think about is that clarification is not simplification. And I'll kind of return to that when we talk about how to actually translate from natural language to formal language. But as I kind of point to this idea, I wanted to start with a little anecdote from my grandmother. So when I was about 8 years old, we had hot lunches at school. And being, the child of an immigrant, we have lunches and that's just the way it is. But my grandma wanted to spoil me and get me more acclimated with my classmates. So she would give me $1 every Friday to buy something and treat myself to a hot lunch at school. They had these things on the left side called Jamaican patties. They're basically a turmeric puff pastry stuffed with meat. And I thought that they were the most delicious things at the time. But there was no word for patties in Chinese, and my grandmother didn't speak any English. So instead, I kind of phonetically sounded it, and it sounded quite similar to pandas. And so I would tell my grandma that I was buying these pandas every Friday for lunch. And without context, it would sound like I was kind of buying and consuming endangered species. But what really is that my grandma knew because I described what it was. I explained to her what these pandas are. And so in that kind of mindset, that's how I started to think about what we need to do if we were to think of moving from natural language and this historical medium, this historical casing that we use to communicate the law, and having that as a formal language. And by formal language, I mean computer code. So what are some issues kind of with natural language? I kind of identified 3, and it's ambiguous word meaning. So these are US Supreme Court case of the infamous question, is a tomato a vegetable or a fruit? Obviously, it had legal implications at the time because it was relevant to import fees. So ambiguity, I define it usually as having more than one meaning, but it is clear what are the options. And then there is vagueness. And this is a case kind of from the Massachusetts court, and it was presented to ask whether or not a burrito fell within a sandwich, the definition of a sandwich. And so vagueness I see as you have an idea and there's some type of implicit world knowledge as to what something is, but you don't quite know the parameters clearly. And then the third thing is contextual ambiguity. And I call that sort of when you say sentences that are beyond the literal. So if I said, oh, there's an elephant in the tree, and from a quite literal perspective, it'd be hard to imagine, a prototypical example of an elephant and whether or not, it can be on a literal tree. And so it might be that someone had got the idiom wrong, like elephant in the room, or that there's some sort of paper elephant maybe floating in the tree. And these kinds of problems associated with natural language, they carry forth in legal language because it simply is the natural fiber of, human language. It has flexibility, it has stretchiness. And linguists consider this as part of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, to an extent, kind of whether or not language constructs thought. It helps with the categorization. And there's kind of gradients and a spectrum to how strongly this hypothesis extends. I typically turn to 2 cases and how the language is so seeded as well into the culture. And these 2 cases have identical facts. They're both associated with a same-sex couple that one of the partners, unfortunately, had passed away and wanted to pass on the tenancy to his partner. Unfortunately, according to law, and this was before kind of the legalization of same-sex marriage, this was only possible if they were a spouse. In the French circumstance, as you see in the first case, the Vilela, the court had denied the partner the continuation of the lease because they had reasoned by cabining the word of spouse and limiting its meaning. In the latter case, it was Fitzgerald. It's in this UK Supreme Court. Instead of spouse, they decide to analogize with family because there had been an existing precedent around an uncle and a nephew was his caretaker. So I find these cases really interesting because they're using the exact same words, but it seems to be driving thought in a different way. And so when we kind of look into how to move, again, from natural language to formal code, a lot of it seems to be driven by beyond just this logical form of the sentence and of words.
And this is such an important area for example, for the canons of contractual interpretation, and similar things, similar considerations will operate in the context of legislative and statutory interpretation as well. But I know that the doctrinal position traditionally in England and Wales and in Australia have been a little bit different. In this country, as I understand the position, it's been a little while since I've been working in Australian law. I've been overseas for 10 years, but as I recall, generally you ask, is there ambiguity? And if there is ambiguity, then you can look to context. Whereas the more contextual approach that was taken for many decades in England and Wales, following, I think, the ICS and West Bromwich case from memory, was in order to establish whether there's ambiguity, you look at context, because you don't really know what the words mean, and therefore whether the meaning is clear or unclear or ambiguous or duplicate, until you've looked at the context. And this is it's a very, very fundamental point that goes to how we understand words to work. And the danger that I see is if we take this more textual approach and we say, no, we only look at context when there's ambiguity. In the context of highly formal things, especially in computational or machine readably expressed legal propositions, if they run, then there's an arguable case to be made that there's no ambiguity, even if they produce a really perverse outcome.
Yeah, I mean, you make absolutely a really excellent point. And one of the things that I will be talking about is how linguists have started to understand how to formalize context. Are there actually identifiable patterns, or is it just the way that we need to establish what is our prior knowledge? I think before I delve into that, I think about sometimes what Douglas Hofstadter says, and he has this idea of isomorphism, and that in order for us to kind of move between these linguistic mediums, we have to have some level of meaningful isomorphism, but this has this kind of assumption that all of the conditions between these languages are identical. And that simply is not the case. And what we've seen so far is that the way formal languages and computer code is regarded, it's much more deterministic. And if we think that there could be a one-to-one matching, it's just not actually translation, it's transliterating. How do you find the kind of exact equivalent? But what if there is no equivalent because we don't understand kind of the natural structures of these languages? And I think that kind of points to how I see currently the way that we use code is heavily in the syntactic and the semantic space, syntactic being the sentence structure and semantic being the logical form. But we don't really move beyond that. And the linguists actually have this third pillar called pragmatics. And pragmatics is kind of the study of context and the circumstantial environment. So how do we actually represent that? And what does that actually mean? What is the kind of cognitive exercise that we're doing actually in uncovering context? So I could probably skip this, but this is another kind of, I guess, thing I think about because part of translation requires actually interdisciplinary dialogue, and particularly in the field of computational law. We work very closely between law and computer science, and sometimes we are saying things past each other because we use the same words, and I tend to call these things faux amis. When I was learning French, we were alerted to these words that looked like English, but were actually had very different meanings. So attendre, for example, in French is to wait, but actually it looks very close to attend or to care for. And if we're not careful in moving between, say, law and computer science or reconciling these fields, you can run into a bit of trouble, or you can represent things not precisely in the way that we want to want them to be communicated. And so how I think about this is actually this gap between execution and interpretation. A lot of what we see right now in machine readable versions of actual legislative text or contracts, it's a version, it's an interpretation. But part of execution requires, or executing of rules is the interpretation of them. And there may not necessarily only be one interpretation, there could be multiple interpretations. And following that light, there is a distinction between human and machine interpretability. It's very consistent with following of rules in machine contexts, but for humans, actually, it's a gathering of prior knowledge. And it's this somewhat back and forth negotiation in our minds. So especially in a kind of field like law, where much of the texts are intertwined, they're connected in an ecosystem type way. It's important that we don't actually forget some of the history, the precedent that led us there, and understanding actually how meaning has evolved over time. I think it's one thing to craft kind of from a formal or draft in code and want to get a better grasp, be clear about the way that we define, but we cannot just erase all of these legacy documents and legacy legal texts that we have. So part of one thing that I'm interested in kind of exploring more, and I welcome, anyone to engage and collaborate here, is applying kind of these linguistic frameworks and drawing from linguists to understand how we can better gather and formalize context. So I push forward this notion called the pragmatics of code. As I mentioned, pragmatics is this pillar in linguistics that focuses on circumstance, it focuses on context, and the ways in which meaning can extend beyond the literal. In this case, it's how to use code kind of beyond its functional capacity. As I mentioned, right now, we're very sensitive to how do you, get from point A to point B. And actually, one of the scholars, Nick Montfort, he is a software studies scholar. He put forward this thing called exploratory programming. And they were saying that code is a form of sort of this action in a sense, where code is the solution, but rather we should be thinking about code as a sketchbook. How do we kind of navigate? And that's because how we draft actually affects the way that we interpret, and there's a kind of shaping that's a symbiotic effort between drafting and actually interpreting. So
I think that's such a fundamental point that you touch on as well, and one that I think often gets lost in conversations between lawyers and programmers, for example, is that any application of a norm, and that might be taking place through the execution of code in some sort of runtime environment that, I don't know, issues me with a parking ticket, for example. To take the classic example, no vehicles in the park. If I'm riding my mobility scooter through the park and I'm issued with an infringement notice by some automated system, I'm thinking of this example very much off the cuff. That system has made a determination that my mobility scooter is or is not a vehicle, for example. And this instance of norm application concretizes its meaning in a fact scenario, which is actually an instance of norm creation, of legislation, right? And I think that's a point that sometimes is missed in these interdisciplinary conversations, which leads me to the question: should we be thinking of a two-track development? To what extent should we be working on establishing, for example, the pragmatics of code, which is a hugely ambitious sort of an undertaking? And short of that, to what extent is it a legal engineering question where we maybe look to devices you know, embedded in, for example, a smart legal contract or a smart statute or something, or a smart regulation, which kind of have oracles or links to sources of meaning outside of that instrument or that system.
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating point, and something that I explored in my thesis as well, is a notion I just loosely named as hybrid forms. And whether or not we actually have to go through, as you say, this legal engineering exercise or a sorting exercise between what we have to preserve in natural language simply because of the richness of the potential context behind it, and what can be quantified and made formal. And it's a great point, Annette, to Peter Hunn, who is actually the co-editor of the book. He has his work with Accord Project, and they see it as the layering exercise, that you have, you know, multiple layers, you have like the quantitative layers, and then you have kind of natural language that overlays it. But I think that question, sometimes I think it can lead to traps, because we, to your point, we may not actually know when we can clearly say that something can be formalized. I know Kingwood Mallisons, for a while, they had an adventure where they wanted to do something of a hybrid, where they said that circumstances that are typically clauses or contractual clauses that could lead to unpredictable circumstances, those ones we're going to preserve in natural language. And others, the boilerplate, things that are, you know, the run of the mill, the things that we know are to be very predictable, we can make those as reusable code. That's one method of doing it. We've seen Henry Smith, who, you know, wanted to pitch this idea of modularity in contracts. He kind of had a similar idea. The more general the language that it could be, the more susceptible it may be to formalization. And sometimes I think it doesn't account for the fact that if we have these hybrid forms, we might end up opening the space for even potentially more ambiguity or more vagueness if we were, because it's a decision that we have to make. It's a subjective decision on, you know, what can be formalized, and there are no clear rules at this point. And so sometimes I think about it as an internal conflict of laws. I'm from Canada, and all legislation is to be written in a bilingual way. And what that's created is some form of both bilingualism and bijuralism, meaning that actually in Quebec, because of the history with France, that we actually have a civil law system internal to a more common law system. And this has created kind of variations, and people are actually allowed to seize, you know, the English translation of a French legislation if they find that the English definition is more consistent with their case. And I think there might be the potential, if we continue with these machine readable variants versus the natural language version, that we might find certain interpretations in a machine readable form that is more favorable to someone, and they might kind of choose. So there might be inconsistent applications of the law, and that's something that is a little potentially worrisome in the area of hybrids. But other than that, that is a kind of very pragmatic, in a different sense, like practical step when it comes to formalizing. So if I may, I would like to, I guess, entertain the idea of computational pragmatics. I draw inspiration from
I would too, absolutely.
So I draw inspiration from two scholars actually from Stanford, Michael Frank and Noah Goodman. In 2012, they put forth something called the Rational Speech Act framework. It's basically saying that they're trying to understand how to enrich interpretation by finding likely meaning as opposed to the meaning. And they draw from sort of probabilistic language understanding. So they're trying to calculate what is the likelihood that it means X versus Y. And from this framework, it's sort of launched into other scholars, all in the kind of computational linguistics field. A seminal paper by a scholar named Justine Cow in the group. It's called Question Under Discussion, and this is how they wanted to represent more complex linguistic phenomena, such as metaphor, hyperbole, etc. And basically a couple of examples, and these are kind of quirky ones before I do a little bit more of a legal one. But say I, mention that I am a whale. Megan is a whale, or someone, had called me a whale. It's not very likely that I am quite literally the aquatic mammal. It is more likely that they might be referring to certain qualities that they find similar between myself and a whale. And so part of what the programming exercises, and they just use JavaScript, but I just want to note here that it doesn't have to be JavaScript. This is language agnostic in a way. It's merely the method of considering probabilities. And so what Noah Goodman and Michael Frank are trying to say here is that actually when we read and when we interpret, it's a probabilistic calculation, that there's a higher likelihood that there's this meaning as opposed to another, in a very, very crude sense. And this is dependent on sort of this prior knowledge and that we enter in the prior knowledge. And so the first step is actually tackling the semantics a bit. And as I mentioned, semantics, I see it as that kind of logical basis of language. So it's the logical meaning. And pragmatics is the meaning beyond the logic and what's the guesswork after it. And so as you can see in some of this code, it's really just computing not only kind of these prior, so the various features, and they're kind of entering it as, a binary code of yes, no, like maybe it's large, maybe graceful and whatnot, and kind of trying to compute in a way between the literal listener who will say that, oh, perhaps the name of the aquatic mammal is Megan, as opposed to Megan embodying some of these traits. And so this is kind of one area that they're being explored. And this is similar to the way that you would say, if I were to say, oh, that coffee costs $1,000 or $1 million. The whole point of these types of expressions is more of the impact as opposed to the intention of the speaker. It's what, is desired to be read out of it. And so from this example, there's a little bit more of a legal example. I use a mutual release clause here, for example, and we have these quirks, and going back to kind of the legalese quirks, there's the any and all. One of the arguments that has come up is most lawyers actually know as a technical term of art what any and all means. Grammatically speaking, or from a linguist, they might not or stray very far away from this any and all. Usually it's any or all. There's a clear meaning in law that any and all is simply similar to the definition of any. So why do we keep any and all and not just any? Either case, not something that necessarily have to debate, but if there is value in preserving any and all, then we should kind of program it in. And part of computational pragmatics is building this database of, what is the likelihood that there's one meaning versus the other. And what it, is a computation kind of a very, very crude understanding of how we actually internalize the way that we want to approach meaning. And I think this is something that's very different in comparison to other techniques where, you're trying to ascertain meaning. So I think I will probably stop there in terms of, I guess, some of the thoughts that I have at the moment, but I'm open to answering questions at this point, or if you have questions about some of the...
Absolutely. Look, there's a couple of questions in the chat, which I can kind of run us through, unless Natalia also wants to rejoin. But I did have one question of my own, again, to abuse my prerogative here, which again relates to the the importance of some authoritative institutional context or structure or framework, and the way that the rules as code and smart legal contract movement and the movement towards the codification of legal language generally impacts or might impact the sort of institutional setup of the legal system. So, you know, again, no vehicles in the park, or does the word spouse include, for example, same-sex life partner? These sort of interpretation or construction questions are generally resolved by an authoritative institution, and then its meaning is settled generally for future cases as well, at least in a civil law context, at least in a persuasive way, in a common law context, in a binding sort of a way. What would it mean for the legal system more broadly and the way the whole thing works if we were to impinge on that role of the court, for example, as the authoritative institutional interpreter of the meaning of legal prose?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's an excellent point. I think I definitely do not exclude the sort of the authoritative element behind the decision maker, so the judge who is kind of ascertaining meaning in that regard. I think one of the things I'm thinking about at the moment is the notion of elasticity. It was kind of first put forward by a linguist called Grace Zhang, and she talks about how meaning is a spectrum. And sometimes we hedge the way that we communicate because we don't know necessarily, or that we don't want to, there's certain elements that are maybe missing, or in saying and kind of being very direct, it might cabin us and it will hinder the law to grow in a way. So what do we do about that beyond kind of receiving sort of meaning from the courts? How do we kind of preserve somewhat all of that, right? So in a sense, there's actually kind of two ways of seeing it's who's at the end of the day interpreting it. If it's the court just saying this is the meaning, and then it wouldn't be that difficult to hard code. But what if there's difference over time in how meaning is interpreted? Maybe it's interpreted in this way in some circumstances. And I think the complexity is that we can't really foresee the circumstances. We might say that, yes, in this judgment, it's clear as day, this is the meaning. But again, part of I guess the common law process is what are analogies and kind of what are the material facts that could build these analogies, and those in some ways are incomplete and open. And so we need to learn how to preserve some of this elasticity in our language. And so how do we do so is the big challenge, and kind of why I sort of push forward something called computational pragmatics is we should kind of in a way have some sort of tracking of the history and the legacy behind how legal concepts are shaped, and not just kind of, yes, now it means this. And so I think that's a distinction that we need to work towards, or is of my opinion that we kind of need more tools that value how the law has become where it is now.
Yeah. Megan, we've got quite a lot of questions actually in the chat, and I think we've got about 10 minutes if I'm not wrong. So let's do a rapid fire. First, do we need an escape valve if something like a smart contract goes off the rails? What do you think about that? If it starts to produce perverse results, and how do we determine what a perverse result is?
Mm-hmm. So that's a fantastic question. And some of these things I'm exploring through critical code studies. So there's a scholar named Mark Marino. He encourages people to read code like literature. And I think if we are kind of being brave enough to conceive of code as the next linguistic medium or next medium of communicating the law, we also need to understand that code can be interpreted to an extent, and that it is not, as always, super deterministic. And so to your question, yes, we might need an escape valve, but I might challenge the fact that smart contracts are a little bit different than all types of coding. They're very specific to blockchain and the kind of crypto technology. So this might be actually not the perfect answer, because it depends on what purpose you want to code certain legal texts. So is it that necessarily we require the smart contract technology, or maybe we want to venture into computable contracts, or maybe we're using rules as code? So it's I guess what I'm putting forward in my arguments are being more conscious of the tools that you're using when you draft legal text, because at the end of the day, the drafting shapes the interpretation.
Yeah. In a paper, in quite a fun paper that should be coming out soon, I hope, I discuss Goethe's poem, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and most of you will know the Disney Fantasia version, but he commands the automaton, which he sort of calls from the nether realm, to go and fetch water and fill the bath, but he doesn't say stop when it's full. So the thing fills the house till it's overflowing, and his boss has to come back and save him. And again, on the command that he gives to the automaton, there's no way really of saying whether this is a perverse result or the desired result, and that can get very sticky. Great. So rapid fire. That was 3 minutes. Beautiful, even with my interventions. How are rules as code and smart contracts going to affect judicial processes? Is it going to make things quicker and more efficient? Is it going to make things, slower and more difficult? What do you think?
So this is, I think, also a bit of it's a great question, but also a tough question. And I see a lot of the comments about, accountability, and I think there's different levels. The question of drafting and then using code to interpret, at the end of the day, we're not taking away from the existing lawmakers. We're saying if we are to imagine, we're not going to draft in natural language, we're going to draft in formal language. It's the next tool that we're doing. How are we sufficiently equipped to do so? And right now, there's this emergence, and there's a kind of question of, does this mean that lawyers have to be coders or be well-versed in code? And the answer is maybe. And you might not necessarily ask that question when, say, you're using comic contracts and you're drawing out, but at the end of the day, it's who is the end user, for a lack of better words, who is the end user reading this type of contract or reading the legislation. There's whether you're using rules as code or smart contracts. Again, I kind of say that these are all just tools, and be it in the future, I think it doesn't change the accountability structure and the judges that will need to kind of learn the impact of, I guess, these types of technologies. It's a question of whether or not, how much legislation is going to be written in these tools, and if it is going to have severe uptake, then we will have to see kind of ways of reading code. And this is something that's, alluded to in some of the literature of, do we need to, is there supposed to be some level of enforceability of, I guess, coders' comments, things that are hashed out, as opposed to the actual executable code. So those are future questions that we will have to think about. But
again, sort of questions of design and whether we just write these things in isolation or with commentary, and what sort of interpretive or canonical value that commentary has. This next question, and it may be our last given time, but it's from Mark Staples, who's a data scientist, I believe, with Data 61, which is under National Scientific Research Institute under the Commonwealth here. And he says, look, when software is written, it's a human expression, but when it's compiled and running, it's part of a physical machine. Expressions in machines don't inherently have legal force, only if law grants it to them. So ultimately, any tragedy from RAC arises from the law, not from the RAC software itself. And I'm reminded here, we could be on a desert island, and I think the Lord of the Flies scenario where they come up with a conventional rule, whoever holds the conch has the prerogative of speaking in the meeting. In situations like this, we often think also of things like lot. You know, whoever draws the short straw is, you know, going to get eaten first in one of those horrible, you know, in the horrible scenarios, or has to swim across the shark-infested reef in order to, you know, go and get the coconuts or whatever. So this brings up interesting questions about what is a technological artifact and how do technological artifacts interact with human normative institutional structures and institutionalized normative orders. So in 2 minutes, what are your views on that huge complex of issues?
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget that law itself is a form of technology in a way. It's been created to help structure society, and that using sort of codified text and writing laws down is itself also a technology. And so the question is are we actually at the precipice of the next linguistic medium to communicate the law? I think if you look historically, like the circuit judges and the history of the circuit judges is this kind of verbal communication of the law. Just this was my problem, and can you mediate and find a solution? And this was appointed by the king. So there's still
written case reports was already a technological step change in terms of using a technological artifact as an authoritative source of truth within an institutional normative order. Exactly. That's a radical proposition, Megan. I like it.
So, I mean, I may have, I'm not sure how well I communicated all of this, but all is to say that I think at the end of the day, if you were to say a judge or lawmakers just refusing to use code, then this wouldn't really be a question at all. It's just if there is going to be uptake, and if we are going to use formal languages, including smart contracts and other rules as code technology, then we need to start thinking seriously of this translation process. But it has little to do with, I think, the accountability structure. It's that will be then changes to the legal profession itself and being capable of interpreting and reading code.
Well, Megan, thank you so much. And in the interest of time, I'll jump the gun and say also on behalf of the Society, thank you so much. I think your work really is shining very valuable light on some of these dark corners. And thank you, Natalia, also for the privilege of taking part in today. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Megan and Jason, what a brilliant session. Thank you for sharing your leading work and for posing the teasing questions, radical propositions. It's been a brilliant session. A huge thank you to the Australian Computer Society for co-hosting this masterclass, and in particular to Mark Potlock, our strategic technology partner at the Australian Computing Society. Subscribe to the Society, the Australasian Society for Computers and Law, to receive invites to this and our future events. Our past masterclasses are available in our YouTube RAC playlist, so please access them. Megan, once again, if you'd like to conclude with a few words, I'd welcome you to do so. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Megan?
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalia. And once again, thank you, Jason. It's been such an honor to be invited here. And just this is an open call. I have my doctoral thesis out there. So if you have more questions, or if I haven't explained anything as clearly, and if you have future questions, open to answering. But thank you again. This has been fantastic.
Thank you all. Stay well. Till next time.
Mm.